afternoon. It's lovely to see you all. Thank you for coming for our lunchtime talk, which is part of the Being Human Festival, the National Festival of Humanities, which happens every year. Dr. Nicola Darwood of the University of Bedfordshire has very kindly agreed to come talk to us. Nicola has been leading on our Being Human Festival in Bedford this year. Just a couple of housekeeping notices. You will notice some feedback forms on your seats. We'd be very grateful if you would fill them in, or if you prefer, you might find a QR code floating around, so do please use that link. Please do. Being Human Being Human Festival, do chase us for feedback. We're not going to test the fire alarm this afternoon, so if you hear it, please assume it's for real. The nearest exit is back through the front door the way you came in. Otherwise, it's round the corridor, out through the tea room and on to the garden. If we're really, really stuck, these windows do open. So please can I check that phones are on silent? And a couple of other things just to draw your attention to. So last week, Professor James Crossley from the Centre for the Critical Study of Apocalyptic and Millenarian Movements gave a talk that is now up on our YouTube channel. And to say that Nicola's talk today will be recorded, it's just an oral recording, an audio recording, so we're not taking anybody's photographs or anything, but that will go up on our YouTube channel in due course. The exhibition that this was inspired by, in her own words, is on display over in our temporary exhibition room, which is, if you follow it round, follow the orange brick road across to Castleside, the big red brick building. That is where you will find our temporary exhibition. This Saturday we have Katie O'Prey, who is a local poet, who's doing a session for young people about writing your own poetry. So I think that is all of my wonderful notices. So thank you all very much for coming. Nicola, over to you.
Thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nicola Darwood. I'm a Senior Lecturer in English Literature at the University of Bedfordshire, and I'm Director of the Research Institute for Media Arts and Performance. My research interests lie firmly in early 20th century women writers, but also literature of Bedfordshire and people who lived and worked and wrote while they were living in Bedfordshire. So this project, this little bit of a project I've been doing, feeds nicely into both those two parts of my research area. So early this year, a group of four of us met here in the museum. There was Victoria and Zara and Lydia MacDonald from the Higgins Bedford. We talked about the festival, about the Being Human Festival, and we started to plot. And at the end of the plotting session, Zara took me around the museum and in particular showed me some of the books that had belonged to Mabel. I was instantly captivated by the thought of a relatively untouched archive. Archives always excite me. And started to think of the ways that I could work with and understand a collection of books which were so evidently important to Mabel and to the Panacea Society. And then in the summer, Vicky Manners, the archivist at the museum, very kindly spent time with me going through boxes of books that formed Mabel's library. I became intrigued by the huge variety of subject matter that had helped to form her writing and her thinking. Along the way, there were also some very strangely surprising books, but more of that anon. My plan for this afternoon is to focus on a small selection of the books, talking a little bit about each of them. At times, I'll be considering the historical context, at others, the book's importance for Mabel, and at times, the wider cultural significance of some of the books. I'll also be drawing on Jane Shaw's amazing biography, Octavia, Daughter of God, the story of a female messiah and her followers. And this is just really the start of a project, and I'm hopeful I'll be able to continue to work on the archive. And as I do so, that I'll be able to consider more closely the relationship between Mabel's reading and her writing. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to refer to her as Mabel throughout. I do hope she wouldn't have been too offended. I'll keep my fingers crossed on that one. As you'd imagine, a large number of the books focus on theology, on prophecy. A discussion of these will probably have to wait until another day. Others are novels or books of poetry. Some books she acquired as an adult, where others were given to her either in childhood or in the days before she got married. There is, for example, a copy of Round the World, written and published by D. Murray Smith in 1878, given to Mabel as a school prize. The full title of this book is Round the World, A Story of Travel, compiled from the narrative of Ida Pfeiffer. It is, in effect, a retelling of some of the stories of this traveller who was apparently an astonishing woman. This is from an essay written in 2004. Among the lady travellers of the 19th century, the Austrian Ida Pfeiffer stands out not only for the number of miles she covered, but also for her ability to withstand grueling conditions and all that on a shoestring budget. Between 1842 and her death in 1858, she organised journeys to the Near East, to Iceland, to Scandinavia. She went to Asia, Central Asia, Russia, parts of Africa, North and South America. I feel exhausted even reading out the list. And then finally a trip to Mauritius and Madagascar, which really did for her, and she died soon after she returned to Vienna from that trip. It's really important to think that, though, that unlike a lot of Victorian women travellers at the time, she was on her own. She didn't go with a husband as he was working as a missionary or an administrator or a naturalist. And she did everything on a real shoestring budget. She wasn't wealthy enough to travel in comfort. So an astonishing woman. This tale of an inspirational woman seems a very apt school prize. It was given to Mabel by the Mrs. Thurton at Christmas 1878 as, and I quote from the inscription, a reward for music, geography and English grammar. There are other travel books and some that would be considered souvenir books. So there's The Riddle of Nearer Asia, written by Basil Matthews and published in 1918 by the United Council for Missionary Education. The inside cover also tells us that Basil Matthews was the author of Paul the Dauntless and The Secret of the Raj, etc. I love those etceteras, long list of books, obviously. The Riddle of Nearer Asia, while considered travel writing, is also seen as an important text, providing an understanding of what is now known as the Middle East at the end of the First World War. And in her collection, there are a lot of books about the Middle East and about Israel, a lot of historical texts. But on a lighter note, there's a book called simply Cambridge, which contains pictures by Ernest Hazelhurst and words by Noel Barwell. Now, Hazelhurst was a renowned English landscape painter and book illustrator who worked in watercolours. He also designed posters for the LNER and the LMS railway companies, and his art was featured in many newspapers, including the Illustrated London News and the Tatler. And one of his claims to fame was that he was the main illustrator of 36 volumes of the Beautiful England series of travel books, published by Blackie & Sons Limited, and Cambridge is one of those in that series. It's evident that Mabel really appreciated art and artists. Among her boxes, for example, are a number of volumes of the Royal Academy Illustrated. In her biography, Jane Shaw discusses Mabel's love of reading, noting that her diaries are full of trips to the local library and that they contain lists of books that she was reading. So, for example, in October 1884, aged just 18, her list includes novels by established Victorian writers, George Eliot, Charlotte Bronte, Charles Kingsley and William Thackeray. And some of these can be found in the archive. There are, for example, 2 beautiful copies of Jane Austen's novels, Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. The pictures don't really do them justice. They are absolutely gorgeous. These were both published by George Routledge and Sons, a publishing firm established by Routledge in the mid-19th century. The books are a little bit difficult to date, but I did some research which would suggest that given the address on the inside cover and the coliform, the letter R, that the books would have been published sometime between 1903 and 1911. So perhaps these aren't the editions that she read when she was 18, but rather books bought or given to her some 20 years later. Mabel's copy of Pride and Prejudice, by the way, includes a short note on the inside page which suggests admiration for Austen's writing, written 1811 when J.A. was 22 years old. Her Jane Austen books also provide a fascinating insight into advertising of the time, with adverts on the inside covers of Sense and Sensibility for Eno's fruit salts and Eps's cocoa. Eno's fruit salts were apparently nature's antidote for human ills arising from neglect or violation of her laws. We're also told about the wonderful property of Eps's cocoa, with a commentary extolling its virtues by one Captain David James, late master of the barque Colorado of Glasgow, which was cast away apparently on Staten Island. Too much praise, he writes, cannot be given to this cocoa for the preserved state it was in after being at the bottom of the sea for a fortnight and then washed ashore. There's an explanatory note which adds verisimilitude to the advertisement. The island is apparently situated in the region of perpetual ice, snow and storms. And Captain James continues, After all this test, the cocoa was as fresh and dry as if in the works. Praise indeed. While much of Mabel's reading could be considered canonical, that is, read by established writers who are considered to be good literature, she wasn't obviously averse to reading more popular fiction, noting in her diary in 1885 that she had read rubbish. But her engagement with other more canonical texts is clear to see. So, for example, a copy of Dante's Divine Comedy contains copious notes in her own handwriting. And keen to develop her knowledge and understanding of literature, as a young woman, Mabel enrolled on a university extension class to study the works of Shakespeare. Her love for his writing can also be seen in her library with copies of a child's version of King Henry V, published in 1883, a 1907 edition of King Lear, and Shakespeare's commentaries by Professor Gervinus, translated by F.E. Burnett. There's a review of this book in The Spectator on 24th of April 1875, which isn't the most complimentary. Speaking generally, the reviewer writes, we should say that Gervinus succeeds better with the tragedies than with the histories, and with the comedies worst of all. When the histories, however, are quite serious and unmixed with humour, they are sometimes very well treated. But the reviewer takes Gervinus to task over some apparent inaccuracies. One can never quite get rid of the idea that it's not Shakespeare where we are reading, but a Gervinisation of the poet, which is by no means equally satisfactory. Our most serious complaint, however, against the professor is his everywhere apparent and not unfrequently formulated conviction that each and every one of Shakespeare's plays were written to inculcate some special moral lesson. However, the reviewer does rather generously suggest that it should be stated that very possibly the author may in some cases be belied by the translation. This, though purporting to be made under the author's superintendence, seems occasionally to fail in reproducing his meaning. It is not, therefore, according to the reviewer, an authoritative guide to Shakespeare, but one that should be treated with caution. And given Mabel's views on editing and writing, which I'll come back to later, I wonder if Mabel had read the review, and if she had, I suspect she probably wouldn't have kept it in her library. By the way, just for context, her love of Elizabethan drama also extended to the author of Dr. Faustus, so she had the complete works of Christopher Marlowe on her bookshelf too. Now, Mabel had a real appreciation for poetry. Went too far. For example, she has a copy of Robert Browning's Easter Day, in which a Christian and a skeptic debate the nature of faith. It's the second part of a longer poem called Christmas Day and Easter Day, but was obviously published as a poem in its own right. And there's a collection also of Shelley's poetry, published in 1912, a selection of Keats's poetry, poems of Robert Browning, published in 1911, as well as a rather small collection of poetry called All's Well, Some Helpful Verse for These Dark Days of War. Published in 1915, the poetry was written by John Oxenham, the pen name of William Arthur Dunkerley, to help people through the darkest days of the First World War. Now, Oxenham was apparently well known for his uplifting poetry, which foregrounded courage, hope, faith, and optimism during times of war and hardship. And among the boxes, there's a book of the poetry of Matthew Arnold, published in 1905. Now, this was a gift from Mabel to Vera. I don't know who Vera was. Maybe somebody will enlighten me at some point. But the inscription reads, in remembrance of a very happy year's work together. There are also books about poetry or poets, such as the French academics Pierre Berger's William Blake, Poet and Mystic, which was translated into English in 1914, a book that focuses more on the man and his poetry. This book, which I pulled out and wanted to talk about very quickly, is because it had an interesting journey. According to the inscriptions, it was first given to Rachel Fox by Mabel, and then given to Mabel by Rachel. So a good example of recycling of presents. As she noted in her diary, sometimes Mabel read what she would consider to be rubbish, and there are a few interesting examples in her collection. One particularly caught my attention. It's a volume in the Whitefriars Library of Wit and Humour. I'm sorry, the picture's not particularly good. It was the light, and it's really quite faded. Each of the volumes in this collection is prefaced by two quotations. The first, from Horace, translates as, "So now I lay aside verses and other trifles. My study and my pursuit are what is true and becoming, and to that I am wholly dedicated." On the surface, this seems a little tongue-in-cheek, considering the overarching theme of wit and humour. But the second quotation provides a little clarity. It comes from Joseph Addison and Richard Steele's first editorial in The Spectator in July 1828, although the inscription on the page just gives it as Addison. They write, "We shall spare no pains to make instruction agreeable to our readers and their diversion useful, for which reasons we shall endeavour to enliven morality with wit and to temper wit with morality, that our readers may, if possible, in both ways find their account in the speculation of the day." Andrew Lang, the author of this particular volume in the series, Essays in Little, is perhaps better known for his retellings of fairy tales, which were must-have presents for children in the late 19th century, and some of his books, I think, are in Dillis's boxes. The essays in this book attempt to follow Addison and Steele's admonition to endeavour to enliven morality with wit and to temper wit with morality. There's an interesting chapter on John Bunyan, for example, which tickled my sense of humour, but which also considers the potential for and the dangers of patronising behaviour. It reads, "Dr. Johnson once took Bishop Percy's little daughter on his knee and asked her what she thought of the Pilgrim's Progress. The child answered she had not read it. 'No,' replied the doctor, 'then I would not give 1 farthing for you,' and he set her down and took no further notice of her." This story, if true, proves that the doctor was rather intolerant. "We must not," says Andrew Lang, "excommunicate people because they have not our taste in books. The majority of people do not care for books at all." Continuing with the Bedford and Bunyan connection, it probably isn't of any surprise that Mabel should have had at least one of Bunyan's books, and she does, an edition of Bunyan's The Holy War, which, like The Pilgrim's Progress, is an allegorical novel which depicts fictional people and events to illustrate Christian's spiritual journey. But I want to carry on my exploration of those books which might have been considered rubbish by Mabel. I think I prefer to use the term popular fiction rather than rubbish, before turning to those which caused controversy on publication. I was rather surprised to find a spy thriller in the archive, one which falls into the category of genre fiction, fast-paced with glamorous characters, in short, popular entertainment. The book in question is The Vanished Messenger by E. Phillips Oppenheim. According to the reviewer in the Sussex Daily News, this is an enjoyable bit of escapism, and I quote, "Mr. Oppenheim has excited us before now with yarns of international intrigue. He is at it again in his new novel and does it better than ever. It is a spirited and exciting story." But how, and possibly why, did Mabel come to have such a book in her library? The answer probably lies in her friendship with Minnie Oppenheim, a spiritualist medium who she met when they were both patients in St Andrews. Minnie was the sister of E. Phillips Oppenheim. There are 2 inscriptions on the inside cover. The first is rather terse. Minnie Oppenheim, from her brother, E. Phillips Oppenheim. But the second inscription demonstrates the high esteem in which Minnie held Mabel, and records that the book was given to Mabel on the 23rd September 1916 while she was still in St Andrews. And the inscription reads, "To my precious friend Mrs. Barltrop, with deep love and true friendship for life and eternity, from the author's only sister, Minnie Oppenheim." There are other books in the archive which would fall under the umbrella term popular fiction, such as The Other Wife, a romance written by Olivia Ramsey. There's a list on the inside cover for other books by her. These include The Marriage of Lionel Glyde, The Girl from Gatford, nice alliteration, Sylvia and the Secretary, more alliteration, written at a time when most secretaries are men, and The Romance of Olga Aveling. Now, I haven't come across any of the other titles in the boxes. There may be some, but I didn't find them. So perhaps The Other Wife was a one-off excursion into romance fiction. I mentioned that I wanted to talk about books that had caused controversy on publication. The first of these is a book called The Saint by the Italian writer Antonio Fogazzaro, translated by M. Pritchard Agnetti. Its publication shook the Roman Catholic Church and ended up on its list of prohibited books. There's an article published in 1906 by William Roscoe Thayer which talks about this ban. Senator Fogazzaro, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, in The Saint has confirmed the impression of his 25 years career as a novelist, and now, through the extraordinary power and pertinence of this crowning work, he has suddenly become an international celebrity. The myopic censors of the Index, that's the list of banned books, I can't pronounce it, we'll just stick with Index, have assured the widest circulation of the book by condemning it as heretical. In the few months since its publication, it's been read by hundreds and thousands of Italians. It has appeared in French translation in the Revue des Deux Mondes and in German in the Hochland, and it has been the storm centre of religious and literary debate. Now it will be sought by a still wider circle, eager to see what the doctrines are, written by the leading Catholic laymen in Italy, at which the papal advisers have taken fright. Time was when it was the books of avowed enemies of the Church, some mocking Voltaire, some learned Renan, some impassioned Michelet, which they thrust on the index. Now they pillory the Catholic layman with the largest following in Italy, one who has never wavered in his devotion to the Church. Whatever the political result of their action may be, they have made the fortune of the book they hope to suppress, and this is good, for the saint is a real addition to literature. So the novel focuses on Piero Maroni, and it's a story of his spiritual journey of redemption, which is contrasted with the struggles of Jean Dessalles, philosophical and emotional. And it deals with themes such as love and duty and worldly interests and spirituality. But there are more books in the boxes that either caused controversy or were controversial at the time of publication. Some are political, such as Maurice Maeterlinck's The Current Secret, The Empire and Solution by Reverend William Pascoe Gord, or Christianity in the Crisis. This was written according to the cover by, quote, various professors, bishops, and the archbishops of York and Canterbury. And its long subtitle reads, What has the Church to say in the face of the present unemployment, hunger, financial chaos, economic disorder, international mistrust, and oppression in many countries? The list of contributors includes R. Ellis Roberts, who I know through my research into a writer called Stella Benson, and Dr. Maud Royden, the preacher, suffragist, and supporter of female ordination. For the next few minutes, I'd just like to focus on two texts. The first is Should Faith Offend? Sermons and Addresses, published in 1927 and written by Ernest William Barnes. Barnes was the controversial Bishop of Birmingham, and it seemed that Mabel may have had this particular book for study purposes. And tucked inside its front cover is a pamphlet about the Modern Churchmen's Conference at Girton College, which took place between 17th and 24th September 1928. I'm not sure if she attended, and there's nothing in Shaw's book to suggest that she did, but she certainly made a number of notes against the talks which were of interest to her. And Jane Shaw argues that Mabel found Bishop Barnes's views antithetical to her own position, which leads us neatly onto the second book, by Richard, also known as Dick Shepherd, The Impatience of a Parson. There's a review of the book in the New York Times on 18th December 1927. It's quite long, but it's worth reading in full. It gives a picture of the issues raised, but also the popularity of the book. Mr. Shepherd's book, the reviewer writes, has aroused profound interest in England, where it reached a sale of 50,000 in 3 weeks, and was in a large part serialised by 2 important daily papers. His book is the sort that comes out of a heart flaming at white heat with passionate longing to mould to finer uses and greater beneficence something to which his life and heart are utterly devoted. It is concerned especially with the Anglican Communion in England, and most of its pages are taken up with the presentation and discussion of specific things which he thinks the Lambeth Conference, the ruling body of the Anglican Church, should do and say at its next session in 1930. But there are several chapters dealing with Christianity in general and the causes of his own discontent with the way that it is going that help to illuminate the modern religious movement. He says that Christendom has been accepting the dogmas instead of the ethics of Christianity, and that is now the first duty of Christians to rethink our religion in terms of Jesus Christ. So Jane Shaw explains that Shepherd's vision was the polar opposite to the one held by Mabel, where he was a modernist in his beliefs, a Christian socialist. Mabel was more conservative in both her religious and political views. And so she wrote a response to Shepherd's book, The Impatience of People, using the pseudonym Mark Proctor, proffering her own views. And as much as Shepherd's book was a success, so too was Mabel's, leading to a significant increase in the Panacea Society. Now, Mabel's dislike and distrust of socialism can be seen in a number of her books. For example, Problems of a Socialist Government, written by Sir Stafford Cripps and others. That's what it says on the front page. I don't know the other people. She believed that, as Jane Shaw notes, socialism was the thin end of the wedge, and it was dangerous because it was the root of Bolshevism. And in writing How We Built Jerusalem in England's Green and Pleasant Land, Part 3, published in 1937, Rachel Fox explores these ideas further. Where the devil could not get people wicked enough to become Bolsheviks, he made them socialists. And where he could not make them socialists, he tacked on the name Christian and produced Christian socialism. It is a tiny bud of socialism. I wish I had more time to talk about the books of prophecy, of doctrine, and of ancient scripture, but that will have to wait for another time. But I want to end with just a little side note and introduce a different side to Mabel, that of editor and a teacher of writing. We know from her diaries that she had a great love of reading, something that she carried into her adult life. At one point, she was one of the vice presidents of the Bedford Ladies' Reading Society. They met every fourth Wednesday, and members were, according to their syllabus, encouraged to write papers on literary subjects and to take part in discussions, with intermediate meetings for fuller discussion. And I think about my own book groups. They're nothing like that. And if I had to write a paper for them, I think I'd run screaming for the hills. There were rules too. Everyone was expected to read the book of the month. I'd probably fall down with that with my reading group as well. They had to pay a subscription of 1 shilling a year, and guests paid 6p per meeting, and members had to be both proposed and seconded before they could join the society. The syllabus for 1911 to 1912, which focused on the Romantic period, included poetry by Coleridge, Wordsworth, Lamb, Keats, and Scott. They also read some of Scott's novels. Interestingly, the syllabus mentions that notices can be found in the library, in Miss Rose's shop in the High Street, and Ye Old Bookshop with an E on the end of every word, and Mr. Hocliffe's library. And for those of you who know Bedford or have been around Bedford for a long time, Hocliffe's used to be up the High Street, and in the 1960s it was taken over by Smith's, W.H. Smith's, and became W.H. Smith Bookshop until the Harper Centre was done up and moved across there. There's a small child, I can remember going to Smith's, and they had these amazing, beautiful carved windows, glass windows, curved glass windows are absolutely gorgeous. Anyway, sorry, back to my plan. So Mabel was very keen to read and to learn and to share in that learning. This is evident in her work at one time as a literary editor and writing tutor, giving lessons by post to those who desire to take up literature as a profession. The course of 12 lessons cost 3 guineas, a substantial sum of money. And so I want to leave you with some of Mabel's words, which to me appear to exemplify her attitude to writing. I quote, "The possession," the advertisement notes, presumably using Mabel's own words, "of original thoughts or of the power to work out plots or dramatic problems is one thing. The ability to give those thoughts expression and to clothe those ideas in readable English is quite another. If a writer subscribed to her lessons or to her editing pen, then any," she says, "defects can be eradicated." And then the advert really hits home, I think. Mrs. Barltrop's wide experience has shown how many disappointments might have been avoided and how many hours of painful revision might have been saved if the author under criticism had undergone but a few weeks of training with an expert. So I hope that you found this dive into her collection of books interesting. I've certainly thoroughly enjoyed working on it and preparing it. There is much more that could be done with the archive and the books, whether they belong to Mabel, to Rachel Fox, to Dilys, or to other members. It's a really interesting side to the life and work of the people of the Panacea Society. But above all else, I hope that Mabel wouldn't have found this talk lacking, that I've been able to give my thoughts sufficient expression and that they've been clothed in decent English. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? I have a question actually. Zara and I did a lot of research around this too when we were putting together the exhibition. Everybody please go and
Yes.
But I was lucky enough to have the time to at least skim read both the impatience of a parson and the impatience of the people.
Excellent. Yes.
What do you think about the similarities there as well? I thought that was quite striking. So yes, there's huge differences in their approaches and their beliefs, systems, but they're also both, I felt they were both really wanting reform and wanting things to change. I thought if they could have just sat down and had a chat
Yeah. I think from what I know, I haven't read the two books, I hold my hands up to that, but what I know of Mabel, so many things might have been resolved if she had been listened to. And I think that lack of people being willing to listen to her is really interesting. So we have that book what's her name? The suffragist and I've forgotten her name now. Come back to me. Anyway, Mabel Royden. The thought that there would have been so many, not Mabel Royden, the other one. There would have been so many similarities between their thinking. She wanted ordination of women, and from what I know of Mabel, Octavia, that's also one of the things that she really wanted. So it seems to me that there's some lack of communication somewhere, and I don't know if that's because the society managed to put people's backs up and they just weren't trusted and believed. But that the religious ideology and the doctrine, there does seem to be an awful lot of similarities between the two.
I thought so. I would say overall her main point was more that what's his name, Richard Shepherd.
Yes.
He was leaning far too much into reforming the church, whereas Octavia, Mabel is saying, well, that doesn't matter. We need much more than that. The church of men is going to help.
Yes, and I think yes.
She's very dismissive.
Yeah. Yes, and I can see why she would have been. Why those issues would be like that. No. Yes.
Where did she write these things? She didn't self-publish any books, did she?
I'll hand over to my colleagues from the museum.
The Panacea Society had their own publishing house called the Garden Press, which started out in a hut in one of the gardens, and then they built their own building. So yes, some of their early works were published by other publishers, but they had their own publishing house and they printed their own things. So a lot of it is published by the Garden Press, which is the Panacea Society by another name.
So they just weren't articles in, say, the Church Times or something? No, they're actually her books, and she published under different names. So she had a couple of pseudonyms, and then she obviously published under her own name. And she also, in some of her other early work, she wrote for the Women's Mothers Union, and she actually wrote those as Mrs. Barltrop, which is very, again, this sort of loss of identity, really. So, but that's some of her own.
And her response is apparently penned by Mark Proctor. Yes.
Yeah. But that's interesting because she's calling herself Mark Proctor, but it's already the 1920s, so she's also Octavia. But she's choosing for attention to still have a male pseudonym.
Yes. Because even in those times there would have been more weight attached to a male writer. Yes.
We noticed as well Mark Proctor pops up in the Panacea Society's own journal. Times as well.
Yes.
With opinion pieces, sometimes in the same edition of the journal as with a piece from Octavia. But there'll be a piece from Mark as well.
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. Love that.
Yeah.
From looking at the book she had when she was younger, and not knowing what she became like later on in life, what kind of character would you think she had if you saw that as an outsider? Well, I mean, for example, the book seemed to be, to me, as a non-expert, fairly sensible, interesting. Any woman at the time or girl at the time would have been interested in those books.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, she obviously had a decent education, and she was reading books that would have been read by a lot of people in the Victorian period. I would have loved to have found some Gothic fiction in there and something a little bit different, and some sort of the really exciting fantasy action stuff. But it was a fairly normal sort of reading regime I would expect for somebody of her age, but also somebody of her age who wanted to improve and to learn. Jane Shaw refers to her as a bit of an autodidact, so she's learning a lot from her reading. And I love the fact that she signed up for the course on Shakespeare. I mean, that's just quite astonishing, really. But this desire to learn. And for my limited time with the books, when I talked about Dante's Inferno, there's really quite copious notes in there. She's obviously really studying it really closely in order, I don't know, maybe to write about it or just for her own satisfaction to understand what was going on in the text. So I think, yeah, a mixture of all sorts of things. Yes, I would have liked to see a little bit something more interesting sometimes, but I don't like Victorian fiction.
So she's a clever young woman.
Yes.
Trying to learn more.
Absolutely. That's certainly my impression I have of her.
And I think that's guided by the fact that she had a fairly decent education, so her schooling would have encouraged her to have read a certain type of literature. But we know from Mabel's background that her family was slightly poorer and less educated than all of her other members of her family. So there is always this sense of catch-up for her reading literature, so she can feel that she's on a level playing field with her cousins and her aunts and stuff, which I think is why perhaps she studied some of the literature. So fastidiously is not quite the right word I'm looking for, but with such enthusiasm.
Yeah, it does feel as though some of the reading is, this is what you should be reading.
Yeah.
And this is how you get, and so it's almost like a following a syllabus. And I think it's fascinating when we get to that, the documents, thank you for Vicky, for the thing about the Reading Society, that they actually have a syllabus that they're following, and that she's still encouraging people to write and to think about literature, and to come along with those books and those essays, and to think about things now. So a meeting a month plus an intermediate meeting, there's a lot going on, that constant desire to read and to learn and to develop.
We've been quite interested, it's all that we've never done, but the other people that attended those meetings to have a look at the background of those women.
Oh, wouldn't it just, yes.
Yeah, I never thought about that before.
Yes.
That would be to see whether that marries up with them, coming from an educated background.
Yeah, I was doing some work on this the other day, and I started looking at that thing. I was thinking, right, so who was that person? And I had to start there. No, I can't. I've got to. So that's one side. I haven't got time. But it is. And some of the names look vaguely familiar to me from sort of the idea of Bedford history. So they're obviously, it's erstwhile women of Bedford who are getting together, and some married and some unmarried.
Do we think that the women going to these groups were part of the Panacea Society, or would she have dared to venture beyond the realms of Panacea followers to?
I think a lot of this is before.
This is
before the Panacea Society.
Yes.
But when she lived in Bedford.
Yes.
Before, yes.
Oh,
And
so-
I don't think. Well, I can't remember any names that transfer
No, I
across.
don't think so.
And there's addresses all over Bedford, so the Crescent comes up quite a lot. There's somebody else who's living up to Paris Avenue, which I think one of her relations lived
Somebody
somewhere
lives
up
in
there.
it,
Yeah. So not Panacea Society members.
Mainly this part of Bedford.
Well,
It's
town
small.
centre.
It's
Town,
posh.
It is
Yes.
the smarter.
town centre in this. Well, the Crescent is sort of opposite Bedford Prison now.
Traditionally,
Yes.
the other side of Bedford would have been smarter. Like the Crescent did Paris Avenue. And when you think about it, all the Georgian houses that are actually down the middle of the road. And then as time went on, we've gone from west to east. Because when you think, as you go further that way down Castle Road, they're all small workers' houses.
Yes.
And the houses here are much smaller than the houses that are on the other side of the high street in North Bedford. So that's why you've got some of those addresses. It's only now concentrating.
Yes. I'm slightly uneasy that we almost seem surprised that these women should be involved in.
Oh, I'm not surprised at all. I'm just
Think
delighted.
about the other women. I mean,
Yes.
there's an exhibition in the gallery some years ago about famous women, scientists and things. I mean, in the First World War, people from Bedford schools, women, were doing great scientific
Absolutely,
things.
yes.
So I don't think we should put too much emphasis on the fact that Mabel and her group had a reading group.
No, I think what surprises me about it is that it's so formalised, and they have like the details we were looking at. The position of president was vacant, but they have four vice presidents. They have an honorary treasurer. They have an honorary secretary. It's a really well established entity.
The Women's Institute would have the same things at that time.
Yes, but this is a reading group, so I find it fascinating. I don't know enough about reading groups at that time. I know a lot about book society things and about travelling libraries, but I haven't done that much research into reading groups, and that's a really interesting thing that is something that I want to follow up on at some point, because as a sociological thing, it's absolutely fascinating. And of course, it would have been, not every woman in Bedford would have been able to join it. And I suspect it was probably a sort of middle class activity.
As it still is now.
As it still is now, yes.
I think the thing to remember about Mabel is that she was raised middle class, but with aspirations to be upper middle class, and a lot of her relatives were upper middle class, and social status was very important to her. So she wouldn't have gone to a reading group of working women. She would have gone to a reading group of women who she would have considered, at the very least, her equals, if not her superiors, because that would have given her status.
Do you know who I have a picture in my head? Hyacinth.
There's a physical similarity. Yes. But I think unlike Hyacinth Bouquet, I don't think Mabel muddled up her words. And I think when Mabel spoke, she spoke with purpose. And I think
socially, in a way, she almost could tie up with Jane Austen. Because she was kind of, well, they hadn't got a lot of money, but they were.
Yes, because Jane Austen
got wealthy runs.
Her family, they're kind of stuck in that position where they haven't got the money, but they've got the status. So there's things they can't do, things they have to do, but they get kind of stuck.
I do admire her self-belief, though, in offering writing lessons and editing. Yes. And there's a bit in the flyer that's the advertising pamphlet which says that you send me your manuscript, I'll change it. It will still be your voice, but I'll change everything for you, so it's suitable for publication.
So it'll be all right.
It'll be all right. It'll be fine.
Yes, I'll sort it for you.
You can see how that leads the footsteps to her become the lead.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
So would she have had a governess, presumably, or rather than have
I haven't read presumably, or she would have had somebody. She did go to school.
Yes.
She did go to a school.
So the
North School. It's not in Bedford. It's in Croydon.
There's Croydon. Yes, that's when the school prize that she got the book was from the person who ran the school. It was her school.
So she would have been there as a boarder.
No, day pupil, I think.
Oh, that's
Yeah, she had. She grew up in Peckham Rye, but she had a wealthy widowed aunt who lived in Croydon, who she stayed with a lot.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting, Nicola, you commented that of the notes and the margins. It's everything that Octavia Mabel wrote and read. There's always notes in her own work, in her friends' works, in the works, everything. There's notes. She must have had such a busy mind because she's constantly writing these arguments for and against everything, all of the time, including her own work. Yeah, it's quite an interesting insight into somebody.
Yeah.
Actually, that's much more. It seems terrifying to me.
Some of her writings do have sort of a split personality.
Right.
For example, in her mini autobiography, that's fairly sensible. If you look at some of the articles in Panacea magazine, they're all over the place. They really are. So they seem to give the impression of great erudition, and I've no doubt it was, but they don't seem to make sense. And obviously we know she had mental health issues. I'm just wondering how her writing reflects that.
Yeah, I don't. That's the bit of the project that I haven't got onto yet.
Does she contradict her own short biography then?
Well, I think some of it take a lot to be believed. I mean, when you are talking about your late husband, who she at one point believed to be the reincarnation of Jesus, and then the only thing you mention about it in your autobiography is the mention that he was good at growing lettuces.
Jesus is really famous.
It's almost dismissive. So you've got a pretty important person in her life. You hardly mention them at all apart from being good at growing lettuces.
Her autobiography does focus quite a bit on how the status of her relatives. Again, it goes back to that kind of status was very important to her, and she wanted to get that status across, because actually most of the other members that joined had a better education than her and far wealthier, so they published in a, what should we say, glorified autobiography helps with that.
But
It's not that it's untrue, it's just factual.
but the depth of her reading is quite phenomenal.
Oh, it is. I think it's amazing.
I learned an awful lot by putting this together because Vicky was really kind and she spent the morning with me in the archive and I took loads and loads of photographs. It took me a day and a half to transcribe those photographs into book titles and then several more days to actually start thinking about them. But translations of early scriptures, all the range of stuff is just amazing, absolutely incredible. And the books of prophecy, there's a really interesting one by H.G. Wells, which I wanted to go away and read, as well as really wanting to read some of the more salacious ones. But the romance novels, they just sound so much fun. So there's just a whole range of books in there. It's just absolutely phenomenal and she read them because we know that from the notes that she inscribed.
Yes.
Interesting, H.G. Wells, she read his work and she wrote to H.G. Wells. And we've got a letter in the archive that it goes into quite a bit of detail, and then there's sort of a disappointing comment that they never received a reply. She found a kindred spirit and then was disappointed. We didn't feel the same way. Any further comments or observations? Well, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you very much, Nicola.
You're very welcome.